The cup had barely left her hands when the slap landed. Sharp, deliberate, in front of everyone. The Duchess Dowager did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She simply looked down at Miroslava and said, "A servant who cannot pour does not belong at this table." No one moved. No one breathed until a hand caught hers. Warm, steady, unmistakable. Miroslava looked up, and it was not a footman beside her. It was not a steward. It was the Duke himself. His fingers closed gently around hers, still raised from the blow, and he did not let go. He did not look at his mother. He looked at her, and what lived in his eyes in that moment was not pity. It was something far more dangerous than that, something that would change everything if she was brave enough to let it. If you already have a feeling about where this is going, drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. The silence in that dining hall had weight. It pressed down on the silver candlesticks, on the untouched food growing cold on gilded plates, on every nobleman and noblewoman seated along that long table, who had just watched a duchess strike a servant girl across the face and thought nothing of it. Nothing. Until the Duke moved. Miroslava had not cried. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed had they been watching her face instead of his. She had not flinched back or crumbled or pressed her stinging cheek into her shoulder. She had simply gone still, the way a person goes still when they have been struck so many times in their life that the body no longer wastes energy on reaction. She held the pouring vessel in both hands, her knuckles pale against the silver, and she breathed once, twice. She kept her eyes on the floor, where a few drops of dark wine had fallen from the cup when the blow knocked her sideways, spreading like small wounds across the white stone. She was used to floors. She had studied many of them in the past 2 years. But then his hand closed around hers, and her eyes came up without permission. Visivolo Drakonov, the Duke of Strelnikov, was not a man who touched servants. Everyone in that room knew it. He was not cruel to them, not the way his mother was, but he was distant in the manner of men who have grown up believing that distance is dignity. He gave orders in a low voice and expected them carried out. He did not explain himself. He did not linger. He moved through his own estate as though he were passing through it on the way to somewhere more important, and perhaps he was. Miroslava had served in this house for 8 months, and he had never once looked at her directly. He was looking at her now. His hand had not let go. It was not a dramatic gesture, no sweep of the arm, no raised voice, no performance for the table. He simply stood beside her with his fingers wrapped around her hand, the one still lifted slightly from the blow, and he looked at her face with an expression she had no name for, not pity. She had catalogued pity from every angle in the past 2 years, and this was not it. Pity looked away quickly. Pity offered coins. This was something that held Vsevolod. His mother's voice came from the head of the table, measured and cold. Dowager Duchess Oksana Drakonova was 60 years old and had spent all 60 of them being obeyed. She did not shout. Shouting was for women who were not certain they would be heard. Release the girl. He did not release her. The table had gone entirely silent. Even the fire seemed to shrink. Miroslava became aware. in the hot and dizzying way of someone trying very hard to stay composed, that her cheek was burning, not just from the slap, from being seen, from having this man's eyes on her face in front of 20 witnesses, his warm hand around hers, while his mother watched, and the candles threw gold across everything, and the world waited to find out what kind of man he actually was. She had wondered that herself, in quiet moments. The wondering had felt dangerous, so she had buried it. Miroslava. His voice was low, just her name, but he said it the way people said names they had practiced privately, not the clumsy pronunciation the other staff used, stumbling over the middle syllables like it was a burden. He said it cleanly. She did not know what to do with that. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Are you hurt?" Somewhere at the table, someone drew a sharp breath. The Dowager Duchess set down her wine-glass with a click that was as loud in that silence as a gunshot. Miroslava opened her mouth. The correct answer was no. The correct answer, the safe answer, the answer that would let this moment dissolve and the dinner continue and everyone pretend the last 2 minutes had not happened, was, "No, Your Grace, I am perfectly well. I apologize for the disruption." She knew how to give that answer. She had given versions of it her entire life. "My cheek stings," she said instead. She heard the breath he took. He released her hand then, slowly, as though reminding himself where he was and what the walls of this room demanded of him. He stepped back. He did not look at his mother. He looked instead at the head butler standing rigid near the door, a man named Fedor who had served this house for 30 years and was currently experiencing what appeared to be a quiet internal crisis. "Have the evening meal brought to my study," Vsevolod said. "I find I am not hungry here." He left, not dramatically, not with a sweep of a coat or a rattled door. He simply walked out of the room, and the room reorganized itself around his absence like water closing over a stone, the guests turning to each other in low, urgent voices, the Dowager Duchess sitting very upright and very still at the head of the table, with an expression on her face that Miroslava did not let herself look at for more than a second. She bent and retrieved the wine vessel from the floor where she had set it. She straightened. She walked back toward the serving corridor, with her cheek burning and her hand still warm where he had held it. And she did not run, and she did not cry, and she did not let a single person in that room see how hard her heart was working. It was only when the corridor door closed behind her and the noise of the dinner resumed on the other side that she pressed her back against the wall and let herself breathe. Ksenia was waiting, wide-eyed, holding a folded cloth she had clearly run to fetch the moment she heard what happened. She was the youngest of the kitchen maids, 16 and soft-hearted, and she pressed the cool cloth toward Miroslava's face with both hands and said nothing, which was exactly right. Miroslava took it, held it against her cheek. The cold helped. "She has done it before," Ksenia said eventually, quietly. "To Daria, to old Polina before Daria. She does it when she thinks they have embarrassed her." "I know," Miroslava said. She did know. She had known when she took this position what the Dowager Duchess was, had heard it in careful half-sentences from the woman who arranged her placement here, had filed it away as a thing to navigate rather than a reason to refuse. She had not had the luxury of refusing. She did not have the luxury of refusing much. 2 years ago, Miroslava Veltova had been the youngest daughter of a merchant family in a city 400 miles from this estate, with a modest dowry and a mother who loved her, and a future that, while not grand, had been hers. Then her father's business partner had taken everything with a signature and a lie and a judge who owed him a favor. Her father's heart had broken in the way that meant it did not recover. Her mother had gone to live with Miroslava's married sister, whose husband made clear with his silences that 2 extra people were 2 extra people, and Miroslava, who was 22 and proud, and had no intention of spending her life dimming herself to fit through another person's narrow door, had done the only thing available to a woman of her position with her circumstances. She had worked. She was not ashamed of it. She had learned to say that to herself firmly and mean it. There was no shame in working. There was no shame in carrying a wine vessel, or pressing linens, or rising before dawn. What wore at her was not the work. It was the invisibility, the way a room full of people could look through you as though the body standing before them was simply a function, a mechanism, a piece of the house's machinery. After long enough, you began to wonder if they were right. She had been wondering that less lately. She was not sure what to do with the reason why. She lowered the cloth from her cheek and looked at it. No blood, just heat. He said your name, Ksenia said, in a voice that meant more than the words. He was being polite. Miroslava. Ksenia said it the wrong way, the stumbling way, and then stopped and looked at her. He knew your name. Miroslava folded the cloth into a neat square and handed it back. Down the corridor, she could hear footsteps, Fedor, directing the meal to be redirected, the household reshuffling itself around the Duke's quiet exit. The Duke, who had stood beside her in front of 20 people and held her hand. The Duke, who had looked at her face like he was reading something there he had been trying not to find. She tied her apron straight and moved back toward the kitchen, and she told herself it meant nothing, and she almost believed it, and the part of her that did not believe it kept very quiet and very warm all the way to the end of the night. Sleep did not come easily that night. Miroslava lay on her narrow bed in the room she shared with 2 other maids, listening to the soft breathing of women who had no trouble closing their eyes, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to make her mind go quiet. It would not. It kept returning, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, to the feeling of his hand around hers, warm, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and had chosen to spend a piece of it holding her still. She turned onto her side and pressed her face into the pillow and told herself to stop. She was good at stopping. She had built her life in the last 2 years on the discipline of stopping, on catching feelings before they grew roots and pulling them up cleanly and setting them down somewhere outside of herself where they could not do damage. Grief, she had stopped. Longing, she had stopped. The particular ache of watching other women her age move through rooms on the arms of men who had chosen them, wearing the soft certainty of being wanted on their faces like a second skin, that she had stopped too, or at least reduced to something small enough to step over. This was harder to step over. She sat up in the dark and wrapped her arms around her knees and made herself think clearly. He was the Duke. She was the woman who poured his wine. He had intervened because he was not a cruel man, and his mother had done something ugly in front of guests, and it had reflected badly on his house. That was all. Men like Vsevolod Drakonov did not hold the hands of servant girls because of feeling. They did it because of optics or pride, or the particular discomfort of watching their mothers behave badly at dinner tables. She had misread the look in his eyes because she was tired and her cheek hurt, and she had not been looked at directly by anyone in a very long time. That was the truth. She held it in both hands and refused to let go of it. But the truth had a second layer underneath, and she knew it, even lying there in the dark trying to be sensible, because it was not just tonight. Tonight had simply been the crack that let the light in on something she had been keeping in a locked room inside herself for 3 months. It had started small. So small she had almost missed it. She had been in the library in early autumn, returning a set of volumes that the Dowager Duchess had requested and then not opened. When she heard him, he was on the other side of the tall shelf, speaking to his estate manager, and she had moved quietly so as not to interrupt, and then stilled when she heard what they were discussing. There was a family in the northern village, a father who had taken ill, children going hungry while the harvest sat unworked. The estate manager was explaining the options in the dry language of accounts and logistics, and Vsevolod had listened without interrupting and then said simply that the estate would send workers and the family would not pay a grain for it, and if the man recovered, they would work out terms after winter, and if he did not, they would work out different terms, and either way the children would eat. He had not said it like a man performing generosity. He had said it the way people said things they had already decided alone, without an audience, before the conversation began. She had stood behind that shelf with 3 heavy books in her arms and felt something shift. Then there had been the morning she dropped an armful of pressed linens on the main staircase 3 weeks later. And he had been coming down as it happened, and he had stopped and looked at the linens scattered across the steps, and then at her. And instead of the blank dismissal she expected, he had asked in a voice that was almost careful whether she needed help. She had said, "No, Your Grace, of course not," and he had nodded and walked past. But he had asked. In 12 months of working in various houses of the noble class, no one above the rank of housekeeper had ever asked her that. Small things. She had catalogued them the way she catalogued everything now, methodically, without letting them mean too much. But they had accumulated, and now tonight had happened, and she was sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, unable to stop thinking about the way he had said her name. She pressed her fingers against her still tender cheek and made herself remember the rest of it. The table full of people who had watched and said nothing. The Dowager Duchess with her cold eyes and her colder voice. The house Miroslava walked through every day with her spine straight and her expression empty because it was the only armour she had. She had not always needed armour. She had been, in what felt like another life, a genuinely light person. Her mother used to say she came out of the womb looking for something to laugh at. She had been curious and quick and a little too stubborn for her own peace of mind, the kind of girl who asked too many questions and held too many opinions and was told regularly that both these qualities would make her difficult to marry, a warning she had received with great indifference. She had grown up in a house full of books and moderate warmth, and the certainty, unexamined the way certainties are when you are young, that the future would be navigable. Then Gennady Yurlov had walked into her father's business and smiled and shaken hands and spent 2 years becoming indispensable before he picked the lock on everything and walked out with it. She still could not think his name without her jaw tightening. Not from heartbreak. She had never had the misfortune of loving Gennady Yurlov. She had met him only 3 times and found him slippery in the way of men who are always agreeing with you. What she felt when she thought of him was a clean, clarifying fury, the kind that had kept her upright in the early months when upright was very difficult to be. He had taken her father's lifetime of work. He had taken her mother's security. He had taken the future that Miroslava had held, not greedily, not with both hands, but with a quiet, ordinary trust that the ground beneath her would hold. She had learnt from that. She had learnt to check the ground. That was why she was still awake, because she could feel, with the instincts of someone who had been ruined once by trusting too quickly, that something was shifting in this house, something that had her name in it, and she did not know yet if it was the kind of shift that broke things or the kind that built them, and until she knew, she needed to be very, very still. She lay back down. She closed her eyes. She made her breathing slow. In the morning, she decided she would be sensible. She would carry out her work and keep her eyes down, and she would not think about warm hands or careful voices or the way 20 people had watched in silence while one man decided she was worth standing beside. She almost managed to believe that was possible. The morning arrived grey and cold, and Miroslava was already in the kitchen when Ksenia came in flushed and breathless, with news that moved through the serving staff the way news always did in large houses, faster than anything that had ever come by post. The Duke had spoken to Fedor. Miroslava's hands stilled on the bread she was slicing. She did not ask. She waited, and Ksenia, who did not have the self-control to hold anything for longer than 90 seconds, leaned across the kitchen table and said it in a low, rushed voice. The Duke had spoken to Fedor last night after dinner. He had made clear that no member of his household staff was to be struck by anyone, including family. He had not made a scene of it. He had not called a meeting or made a declaration. He had simply told Fedor, and Fedor had told the housekeeper. And now everyone knew, because everyone always knew everything in a house like this before breakfast. Miroslava set down the bread knife. She was not sure what she was feeling. It was too large and too mixed to be one thing. A tangle of gratitude and unease, and something warm underneath both of those that she immediately pressed down hard on. He had not done it for show. There had been no audience. He had gone to his study and eaten alone, and then sent a quiet instruction through the proper channels, the way a man did when he meant something, rather than when he wanted to be seen meaning it. She picked up the knife again. She finished the bread. She kept her face neutral, because the kitchen had 5 other people in it, and she was not going to be the subject of this morning's conversation if she could prevent it. But her heart was doing something inconvenient, something she could not fully quiet. And as she worked, she thought, with a kind of exhausted honesty she usually reserved for the space just before sleep, that this was precisely what she had been afraid of. Not him, not the Dowager Duchess, or the whispers, or the distance between his world and hers, though all of those were real dangers. What she was afraid of was simpler and worse. She was afraid of hoping. She had not hoped for anything in 2 years. Hope was expensive. Hope kept the wound open. She had survived by wanting nothing beyond the next day, the next task, the next small, manageable, ordinary thing, and that survival had cost her something, some essential brightness, but it had also held her together. And now there was a man 1 floor above her who knew her name and said it correctly and had held her hand in front of a room full of people who thought her invisible, and she did not know what to do with that except to be very careful with it. She heard footsteps in the corridor above the kitchen ceiling, heavy, unhurried, the particular rhythm of someone who owned every floorboard he walked on. She did not look up, but she listened, and her hands, steady and capable and trained not to shake, were shaking slightly as she moved to the next task, and she let them shake because no one was watching, and because some feelings she was learning were larger than discipline. Outside the kitchen window, the estate grounds stretched grey and frost-bitten into the distance, and somewhere in this house a man she did not yet understand was moving through his morning, and the day had barely started, and already it was asking more of her than she had planned to give. 3 days passed without incident, which in this house meant 3 days of Miroslava waiting for something to happen. She was not naturally a waiting person. Waiting had been forced on her, the way most disciplines are forced, by circumstances that left no other option, and she had got good at the stillness of it without ever making peace with it. She did her work. She rose before the sky lightened, and she moved through the house's routines with the quiet precision she had spent months building, and she kept her eyes where they were supposed to be, and she did not look for him. She did not need to look. She was always aware of where he was, not in any way she could justify or explain. It was simply there, some low and involuntary attention her body had developed without consulting her mind, so that she knew when he entered a room before she saw him and felt his absence in corridors she had just come from. She hated it with a thoroughness that had no effect whatsoever on its persistence. On the 4th morning, Fedor came to find her. She was in the east parlour, working through the weekly task of cleaning the glass on the portrait frames, when the head butler appeared in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not read. Fedor was 63 and had the face of a man who had long ago decided that expressions were an unnecessary luxury. But there was something behind his eyes that morning that made her set down the cloth and turn fully to face him. He told her the Duke had requested she bring the morning tea to the study. She stood with the cloth in her hand and looked at him. "Requested," she said. "His word," Fedor said, and there was something in the way he said it, careful and even, that told her he understood as well as she did that this was unusual and was choosing not to say so. She nodded. She went to the kitchen. She prepared the tea tray with hands that she commanded very firmly to be steady, and they mostly obeyed, and she carried it up the main staircase and along the east corridor to the study door and knocked. "Come in." The study was a room she had cleaned twice in 8 months, but never while he was in it. It was large and book-lined and smelled of firewood and something underneath that, something darker and warmer, cedar or old paper, or both. He was standing at the window when she entered, not seated at the desk, looking out at the frost-pale grounds with his hands clasped at his back, and he did not turn immediately. She set the tray on the low table by the chair and straightened and waited. "How is your cheek?" Not a question. Quite. more like something he had been holding and set down. "Healed," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." He turned from the window then. In the grey morning light he looked different from how she usually saw him, which was in the managed brightness of dining rooms and corridors. Here the light was honest, and it showed the tiredness around his eyes, the way his jaw was set slightly too hard for a man simply waiting for his tea. He was looking at her with that quality of attention she had already learned to be afraid of. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not correctly." She clasped her hands in front of her and said nothing, which he seemed to understand as permission. "How long has she been doing it?" Miroslava's chest tightened. She knew exactly who he meant and what he meant, and the honest answer and the correct answer were standing very far apart from each other, and she could feel the distance between them like a cold draught. "I cannot speak to what happened before I arrived," she said. "That is a correct answer," he said. "I asked for an honest one." She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that had patience in it, and something more complicated under the patience, something that looked almost like guilt. It occurred to her that this was not a conversation he had arrived at easily. "7 months," she said, "that I know of." He closed his eyes for just a moment. One breath. Then he opened them and nodded, as though she had confirmed something he already knew and had been hoping not to know. "She does it when she thinks I won't find out," he said. It was not an excuse. It was not even entirely an explanation. It was more like a man reading a document aloud that he was ashamed to have not read sooner. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "it is not your fault." "No," he said, "but it happened in my house." There was nothing she could say to that which would not either flatter him or diminish what he was clearly taking seriously. So she said nothing. He moved to the desk and sat, and picked up a small folded document from its surface, and turned it between his hands without opening it. "I have been making inquiries," he said, "about your previous placement." Her whole body went still. She watched him turn that paper in his hands, and she felt the ground doing what it did, the quiet preliminary shifting she had learned to recognize, and she waited. "The household where you were placed before this one," he said. "I know the family. I know the head of it." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were steady and direct, and asking her, without words, whether she wanted him to continue or whether she wanted him to stop. It was the most extraordinary courtesy she had been shown in 2 years, that silent question, and it almost undid her more than anything else had. "Say it," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "The man lied about your character when you left. He gave a poor reference to 3 households. You could not find a suitable placement for 4 months. She knew this. She had lived it. But hearing it spoken plainly, without softening, by someone who had no reason to have looked for it except that he had gone looking, was a different thing. Her throat did something she would not allow to go further. "He was angry," she said, "because I would not do what he asked of me." "I know what he asked," Vsevolod said, and his voice had dropped to something flat and precise that she recognized instinctively as the voice of a man keeping his temper in a box. "I spoke to 2 people from that house." The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved against the window glass. She had not told anyone, not Ksenia, not the housekeeper, not the woman who arranged her placement here. She had been afraid that telling would simply move the damage around, that it would become her story instead of his wrongdoing, that she would carry the telling the same way women always ended up carrying these things. So she had been quiet, and she had moved to the next house and the next task, and she had locked it in the same room where she kept everything else she could not afford to spend energy on. He had opened the room without a key. She did not know how to feel about that. "Why?" she said. It came out before she decided to say it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because something was wrong," he said. "A woman with your capability and your composure placed in a servant's role in a house like this does not arrive here without a reason. I wanted to know the reason." Her composure, which she had been gripping with both hands, shifted slightly. "And now that you know it," she said, "what do you intend to do with it?" He set the paper down. He looked at his hands on the desk, then back at her. "I have written to the man," he said. She went cold. "Your Grace, not in your name, in mine." He said it firmly, not harshly, in the voice of someone who had thought this through before she walked into the room. "I have made clear that certain documents he signed will come to the attention of certain people if the references he gave do not find their way to a correction. He will comply. He has more to lose than you do." She stared at him. This was not how men in his position behaved. She knew this precisely because she had spent 2 years watching men in his position behave, and what they did when they learned inconvenient truths about the people below them was set those truths aside and find more comfortable company. They did not go looking through old records. They did not speak to former household staff. They did not write letters on behalf of women who poured their wine. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know it may cause you difficulty." "Very little," he said, "less than it cost you." She could feel something moving in her chest, something she had been sitting on for 3 days and 4 months and 2 years, and she pressed down on it with everything she had because she was standing in his study and she could not afford to be anything other than composed. "I would have handled it," she said. "You were handling it," he said. "That is not the same as it being just." She had no answer for that. She had not expected him to say anything true. He stood from the desk and moved back toward the window, not toward her, and she understood the movement as a kindness, as him giving her space to reassemble herself, and she was grateful and furious about being grateful in equal measure. She picked up the tray cloth and straightened it unnecessarily. Her hands were doing the thing again. Miroslava. She still. His back was to her. He was looking out the window again, hands at his back, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the careful way he was holding himself. "My mother is leaving for her estate in Vologda at the end of the month," he said. "She goes every winter. She will take her household preferences with her." A pause. "Things will be different here when she is gone." She did not know what he was telling her exactly. She knew what she heard underneath it, and she knew she was not supposed to hear it. And she knew that the warmth moving through her at the hearing of it was a problem she did not currently have the resources to solve. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. She took the tray and she left. In the corridor she walked at her normal pace, with her spine straight and her expression clear, and she did not stop until she reached the linen staircase that no one used at this hour, and then she stopped and put her back against the wall and stared at the ceiling and pressed one hand flat against her sternum where her heart was being completely unreasonable. He knew. He had gone looking and he had found it, and he had acted on it quietly and without theatre, and he had told her without making her feel like a charity case, which was the more remarkable thing, the thing she was having the most trouble setting down. She closed her eyes. She thought about his voice, saying, "Things will be different here when she is gone." She thought about the way he had stood with his back to her when he said it, not watching her face for a reaction, just saying it into the window glass, like a man leaving something out for someone to find or not find as they chose. She was going to be very careful, she told herself. She was going to be very careful and very sensible, and she was not going to build anything on a foundation she had not tested. But somewhere at the end of that long corridor, behind a closed study door, was a man who had gone looking for her story when he had no reason to, and found it, and acted on it, and she did not know yet what that made him or what it made this. And the not knowing was the most awake she had felt in 2 years. She pushed off the wall, she walked back toward the kitchen, and she did not notice, through all of it, the figure at the far end of the upper hall, watching her go. The Dowager Duchess stood with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and the look on her face was not anger. It was much quieter than anger, and far more deliberate, and it had Miroslava's name written all the way through it. She found out what that look meant 4 days later. It did not announce itself. That was the nature of it. The Dowager Duchess did not move like a storm, with noise and visible approach. She moved like cold weather, like the kind that settles in under doors and through window frames, until you realize, too late, that the temperature of the whole room has changed. It started with the housekeeper. Miroslava had been reassigned, not dismissed, reassigned. There was a careful distinction that she understood immediately was intentional, a cruelty wrapped in the language of practicality. She was moved from the main house rotations, the dining rooms, the corridors, the east wing where the study was, and placed in the laundry. Full-time, effective immediately. The housekeeper delivered this information with her eyes slightly to the left of Miroslava's face, which told Miroslava everything about where the instruction had originated and how much the housekeeper had wanted to deliver it. She said, "Yes, of course," and she went to the laundry. The laundry was in the basement. It had one small window that let in a rectangle of grey light from ground level, and it was hot and loud with the work of boiling and pressing and lifting. And the women who worked there permanently were not unkind, but they were also not her people, and they looked at her with the careful curiosity of workers who know that someone has been sent down to them as punishment and are not sure what to make of her. She worked. She had always been able to work. If the room was difficult, she found something else to focus on. The rhythm of her hands, the small satisfactions of a pressed fold, the way steam cleared her head when she let it. She did not let herself think about the study or the corridor or the man who had stood with his back to her and told her things would be different. Things were, apparently, already becoming different, but not the kind he had meant. On the second day, in the laundry, she heard, through Ksenia, who descended the stairs with the faithful regularity of a girl who understood that information was the only currency available to people with no other power, that the Dowager Duchess had spoken to the Duke the previous evening. Miroslava kept her hands moving. She did not know what had been said. No one knew exactly what had been said. But Vsevolod had been seen that morning crossing the main hall with the particular expression of a man who has absorbed something unpleasant and has not yet decided what to do with it, and the house had the tight, held-breath quality that it got when its two most powerful inhabitants were in disagreement. She pressed a sheet flat and thought about what a woman like the Dowager Duchess would say to her son about a serving girl. She could construct several versions. She had enough experience of how these arguments were built, the way they were assembled from reasonable materials, from concern and propriety, and the language of what is appropriate, into something that functioned as a wall. She thought about Vsevolod hearing those arguments, and she thought about the look on his face when he had told her what he had done about the reference, and she thought about how even the best of men, presented with enough social machinery and the voice of a mother they had navigated their whole lives, will sometimes choose the path of least resistance. She had been prepared for that. She had always been prepared for that. She told herself that believing it did not feel like anything particular. On the third day, the Dowager Duchess came to the laundry. She appeared in the doorway in the mid-afternoon, dressed as though she had simply taken a wrong turn on her way to somewhere more important, her dark gown immaculate against the steam-damp walls, her hands folded at her waist. The other women saw her and went quiet and found things to look at. She looked at Miroslava. Miroslava set down the iron, turned, and did not drop her eyes. The Dowager Duchess crossed the room without hurrying and stood at a distance of exactly enough to make a point of the space between them. She was a tall woman who had learnt to use height the way some people used silence. She looked at Miroslava's face for a moment, not speaking the way people look at things they are deciding whether to purchase or discard. "You are not what I expected," she said. Miroslava said nothing. "Most girls in your position become either very small or very obvious. You are neither." She paused. "I have been watching you for 3 months." Still Miroslava said nothing, because she had learned that a woman like this who was talking had not yet arrived at the thing she came to say, and interrupting would only delay it. "My son is a serious man," the Dowager Duchess said. "He takes things to heart that do not belong there. It has complicated his life more than once." Her voice was perfectly measured, not unkind in its surface quality, the way a blade is not unkind before it moves. "You are a complication he has not recognized yet as a complication. I am recognizing it for him." "With respect," Miroslava said, and her own voice came out steady in a way she was privately grateful for. "I have not done anything to complicate anyone." "You exist," the Dowager Duchess said, "in his sight line, with a face like yours and a quality of composure that men like my son interpret as mystery. That is sufficient." Miroslava looked at her directly. "Your Grace," she said, "I pour wine and press linens. I have no designs on anything in this house beyond keeping my position." "Then we understand each other," the Dowager Duchess said. "We do not," Miroslava said quietly. The room held its breath. She felt the other women go very still, and she knew this was a line that she had just stepped over something she could not step back over, and she did not step back. "I have done nothing wrong," she said. "I have worked honestly in this house for 8 months. I was struck at a dinner table in front of guests, and I did not make a scene of it. I have been reassigned to a basement on no grounds except that your son spoke a kind word to me in front of people who noticed, and I understand exactly what this is. But I will not stand here and agree that I am a complication simply because someone powerful finds my presence inconvenient. The silence lasted long enough to have weight. The Dowager Duchess looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, not quite respect, and not quite fury, but had elements of all three moving beneath its surface. "You will find," she said finally, "that inconvenient presences are managed quietly or managed loudly, but they are always managed." She turned and walked back toward the door. "I leave for Vologda in 9 days," she said, without turning. "That is sufficient time for a sensible girl to make sensible arrangements." She left. Miroslava stood with her hands at her sides, and the iron cooling on the board behind her, and the entire laundry not breathing around her, and she made herself count to 10 very slowly before she moved or spoke or let her face do anything at all. She picked up the iron. She finished the sheet. She worked until the end of her hours, and she walked up the stairs, and she ate supper in the kitchen, and she excused herself early, and she went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dim room, and she let herself feel the full weight of it, because there was no one here to see it. She was being warned out, politely, efficiently, and with enough plausible practicality that nothing could be easily challenged, and she had 9 days to decide whether she was going to go. She should go. Every sensible part of her already knew this. She should arrange a transfer to another household, put this estate and its complications behind her, start the careful work of rebuilding again, in a house where no one's son looked at her like she was something he had been trying not to find. She was good at starting over. She had the skills for it. The beginning was always the hardest part, and she had done it enough times to know she could survive it again. She was sitting there with that knowledge arranged neatly before her, fully prepared to reach for it, when someone knocked on the servants' corridor door. It was not Ksenia's knock. Ksenia knocked with 2 fingers, light and quick. This was quieter. Once, and then waited. She stood. She opened the door. Vsevolod Drakonov was standing in the servants' corridor in the near dark, and he looked like a man who had made a decision that had cost him something to arrive at, and he was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in that dining room when 20 people watched, and he held her hand and did not let go. She stared at him. "I know," he said simply. "Meaning the laundry, meaning his mother, meaning the 9 days, meaning all of it. You know?" she said carefully. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "I was told you had been reassigned for operational reasons. I believed it for 2 days longer than I should have." She held the door and said nothing. "She spoke to you," he said. "She was very clear," Miroslava said. He looked at her for a moment, with his jaw set in the way she had already learned, meant he was keeping something in check. "What she asked of you," he said. "Do you want to do it?" The question landed strangely, because it was the correct question, and she had not expected the correct question. She had expected management, explanation, the careful language of men who mean well and end up doing the convenient thing wrapped in genuine regret. "No," she said. He nodded, once, as though she had confirmed something. "Then don't," he said. She looked at him in the dim corridor, with the sounds of the sleeping house around them and the knowledge of everything that statement cost and everything it opened, and she felt the ground shifting again, but this time it did not feel like collapse. It felt like something settling into a new position, like a foundation finding its actual shape. "Your Grace," she said, "I need you to understand what you are saying. I know what I am saying. Your mother is my mother," he said, quietly and firmly, "and not my sovereign." She pressed her fingers against the doorframe and looked at him and made herself think clearly about all of it, about the risk and the cost and the fact that hope was expensive, and she had not been able to afford it before, and she did not fully know if she could afford it now. But he had come to a servant's corridor in the dark and asked her what she wanted. And she thought about Gennady Yurlov, who had taken everything without asking, and about the households that had looked through her for 2 years as though she were furniture, and about a man who had looked up her story because something felt wrong and had acted on it quietly and without theatre. And she thought that perhaps being careful was right, but being closed was something different, and she had been closed for long enough. "I stay," she said, "if I can stay without it costing you more than it should." Something crossed his face that she filed away for later, for the quiet space before sleep, where she allowed herself to look at things directly. "It costs less than you leaving," he said. She did not have an answer for that. She did not think one was required. He held her gaze for one more moment. And then he nodded, as though something had been decided between them that neither of them had yet fully named, and he turned and walked back down the corridor, and the dark took him, and she stood in the doorway and listened to his footsteps until she couldn't any more. She closed the door. She pressed her back against it. In 9 days, the Dowager Duchess would leave for Vologda, and then this house would be different, and she would be in it, and something was beginning that she had no map for and no armour against, and she was going to let it begin. She was terrified. She was more awake than she had been in 2 years. She went back to her bed and lay down, and this time, without entirely meaning to, she fell almost immediately into a deep and dreamless sleep, as though her body had finally decided that tomorrow was worth resting for. The 9 days did not pass quietly. Miroslava had expected a kind of armed truce, the house holding its breath while the Dowager Duchess packed her trunks and made her arrangements, and the staff moved carefully around the tension the way water moves around stone. What she had not expected was for the Dowager Duchess to use every one of those 9 days with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that time was the only resource she had left and intended to spend it fully. It began with the other staff, not loudly, not with direct instruction, but suddenly the women who had been warm to Miroslava in the kitchen found reasons to be busy when she entered. The housekeeper, who had always been fair, if not kind, began finding additional tasks for her in the laundry, small extensions to her hours that were individually reasonable and collectively deliberate. Ksenia still came, still whispered, still pressed cool cloths and warm bread toward her with the loyalty of the very young who have not yet learned that loyalty has a cost. But even Ksenia was quieter, watching the walls before she spoke. Miroslava noted all of this and said nothing about any of it. She had been through managed silence before. She had been through the kind of cold that a house produces when someone powerful wants you gone and is too refined to say so directly. She pressed linens and carried trays and did her work, and she kept her face clean of anything that could be used, and she waited for the 9th day, the way you wait for weather to change, not with hope exactly, but with the knowledge that it will. What she had not calculated was what the Dowager Duchess would do on the 8th day. She was crossing the main hall in the late afternoon, returning from an errand to the eastern storeroom, when she heard voices from the drawing room. The door was not fully closed. She would have passed without listening. She was almost certain she would have, except that she heard her own name spoken in a voice that was not the Dowager Duchess's. She stopped. The second voice was male and unfamiliar, carrying the particular confident ease of a man who speaks in drawing rooms as though they were built for him. She could not see through the gap, only hear, and what she heard was her name again, and then, assembling itself out of fragments, the shape of what was being said. The Dowager Duchess had invited a guest for the evening, a man named Borislav Orlenkov, a landowner from the neighbouring province, a man who apparently had a widowed sister in need of a housekeeper and had been given to understand that a suitable candidate was available, a girl currently misplaced in a household that did not suit her station. Miroslava understood in the space of 3 seconds exactly what was happening. She was being arranged. Quietly and plausibly, and with no requirement for her consent, the way arrangements were made for women who had no one to speak on their behalf. If she did not respond, if she did nothing, she would be packaged and transferred with a fine reference and a sealed note to a widowed woman in another province, and it would appear to anyone looking that she had chosen it. She stood in the hallway with her back straight and her jaw tight, and she breathed. Then she walked to the study and knocked. He opened it himself, which meant he had been near the door, and the look on his face when he saw hers told her that he read her expression immediately and completely. She told him, quickly, quietly, with no excess, just the facts as she had assembled them from 2 minutes of listening at an almost closed door. She watched him hear it, and she watched what hearing it did to his face, and she was grateful for the first time that he was not a man who performed his reactions because what crossed his face was real, and she needed real just then. He said, "Stay here." She said, "You do not have to." "Stay here," he said again, not loudly. And there was something in the repetition that was not a command, but close enough to one, that she stopped arguing and stayed. He went down the hall. She heard the drawing room door open and the brief sound of voices, and then the door close. She stood in the study with her hands folded and her heart working very hard, and she did not let herself move to the door or try to hear anything, because she had decided to trust this, and trust did not come with its ear-pressed walls. She looked at the room while she waited, the desk with its neat stacks, the books arranged by some system she hadn't deciphered, a small portrait on the far wall, a woman with dark hair and Vesevolod's eyes, younger than he was now, painted in the soft, flat style of 2 decades ago. His mother, she realized, at a time before whatever she had become had fully formed. And she looked at it and thought about how people arrived at themselves, all the steps and choices and losses that build a person into the thing they finally are. She thought about what she was still building. The door opened. He came back alone. She read his face. "He left," she said. "He will not be approached again on this matter." His voice was level and careful, in the way of a man who has recently said something significant, and is now managing the aftermath of it. I made clear that any arrangement of the kind discussed was made without my knowledge and does not have my sanction. She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" she said. He looked at her directly. "The truth." The word sat in the room between them. She clasped her hands in front of her and felt the full weight of this moment, the edges of it, what it cost him and what it was going to cost him further, and what it meant that he had paid it anyway. "Vsevolod," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and she had not planned it. It arrived because the moment required it, and her mouth obeyed the moment before her caution could intervene. She saw him register it, a small stilling, almost imperceptible. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who is rescued. I have managed my own life through things that would have flattened people with more resources than me, and I have come out the other side intact. I am not telling you this to diminish what you did or what it cost you. I am telling you because if something is beginning here, and I believe something is beginning here, I need you to see me clearly, not as a woman you are protecting, as a person you are choosing." He was very still. "Those two things are not the same," she said, "and the difference matters to me more than almost anything else." He was quiet for long enough that she began to prepare herself for the version of this where he retreated, where the weight of it became too particular, too demanding, too much from a woman who was supposed to be grateful and simple and easy to place. "I am not a man who does things lightly," he said. "I do not intervene in drawing room arrangements for women I am protecting. I do not come to servants' corridors in the dark for women I pity." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words not for elegance but for accuracy, which was the more important thing. "I went looking for your story because I could not stop thinking about you. That is the whole of it. There is no version of this that is about rescue." She pressed her hands together and looked at him and felt the ground doing the thing it had been doing for weeks, shifting and resettling. But this time, she let it move without fighting it. "She will not forgive you for this," she said. "She will be angry for a season, and then she will want grandchildren," he said. And it was so plainly honest and faintly exhausted that she nearly smiled, and the nearly smile was the most unguarded thing she had shown him yet, and she saw him see it. The door at the far end of the hall opened. They both heard it. The particular walk, measured and deliberate, that had its own quality of warning built into every step. The Dowager Duchess entered the study without knocking, which was her right and also a statement. She looked at Miroslava and then at her son, and the look she gave each of them was brief and thorough, the look of a woman who has walked into a room and confirmed exactly what she expected to confirm. The silence had a structure to it. "You dismissed him," she said to Vsevolod. "I did," he said, "without discussing it with me. It did not require discussion." She looked at Miroslava again with those level eyes, and this time what was in them was not the cold, deliberate threat of the laundry room. It was something more complicated, a woman encountering something she had tried to stop and had not stopped, and was now in the slow process of reckoning with. There was something in it that was not entirely without respect, though she would never have named it that. "You argued with me," she said to Miroslava, "in the laundry, in front of the other staff." "I told the truth in the laundry," Miroslava said, "in front of the other staff." A long pause. "You are merchant class," she said. "I am," Miroslava said, "and I have worked harder and lost more in the past 2 years than most people in this house have been asked to in a lifetime, and I am still standing, and I will continue to stand, with or without anyone's approval." She felt Vesevolod go still beside her, a different quality of still than before, something that in another man might have been pride. The Dowager Duchess looked at her son. "She will not be easy," she said. It was not a complaint. It was almost, in some turned and complicated way, a concession. "I know," he said. His mother looked at him for a moment with the searching quality of a woman looking at the outcome of her own work and finding it has gone somewhere she didn't plan. Then she looked once more at Miroslava. "The Olenkov matter is closed," she said. "I will say nothing further on the subject of arrangements." She turned toward the door, and at the threshold she paused in the way she always paused, making the frame work for her. "My trunks depart tomorrow morning. I expect the house to be in good order when I return in spring." She left. The room was very quiet. Miroslava stood with her hands at her sides, and her chest full of something that was not quite relief, and not quite triumph, and not quite wonder, but had all three moving through it in different currents. She was aware of him beside her. She was aware of the space between them, how small it was, how it was different from what it had been an hour ago. "That was not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. It was not. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the expression she still did not have a single name for, the one that had frightened her from the first because of how completely it saw her. "Whatever this is," she said carefully, "I need it to move at a pace I can trust." "Tell me the pace," he said. She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of flaws and managed silence, and the particular discipline of surviving without expecting anything from anyone. She thought about the look on his face in the dining room, and the hand at the servants' corridor door, and the word truth, used plainly in a drawing room in front of a woman who would never forgive it entirely. "Slowly," she said. "Slowly," he agreed. She left the study and walked down the main corridor, and did not press herself against any walls this time, did not wait for her heart to settle. She let it work. She let it be loud and inconvenient and full inside her chest as she moved through the house and back toward the kitchen. And she thought that perhaps this was what it felt like when a person stopped stopping themselves. In the morning, the Dowager Duchess's trunks were carried out in the grey early light and loaded onto the carriage while the ground was still frozen, and the house watched from its various windows, and Miroslava stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of wheels on gravel growing smaller, and did not go to the window. She did not need to see it leave. She could already feel the house breathing differently without it. The house without the Dowager Duchess was a different creature entirely. It did not happen all at once. It was not as though the carriage disappeared around the frost-edged tree line, and the walls exhaled, and everything became warm and easy. Houses that have been held in a particular tension for a long time do not release it in a single morning. It happens in layers, in small increments, the way ice at the edge of a river begins to soften days before it actually breaks. The first layer was sound. The kitchen got louder. Not raucous, not undisciplined, but genuinely louder, in the way of a room where people have remembered that they are allowed to talk at a normal volume. The housekeeper, a woman named Agrafena, who had spent 8 months navigating between 2 sets of demands with the grim diplomacy of someone who has chosen survival over preference, came into the laundry on the morning of the 2nd day and told Miroslava quietly that her reassignment was concluded and she could return to the main house rotation. She said it to the wall beside Miroslava's head, not quite able to make it a direct look, and Miroslava understood that this was as close to an apology as the structure of this house allowed, and she accepted it as such. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without bitterness, because bitterness was expensive and she had stopped spending on things she couldn't afford. She went back to the main corridors and the dining rooms and the east wing, and the first time she passed the study door she felt the awareness of it the way she always did, that low, involuntary attention, and she kept walking at her normal pace and did her work, and told herself that slowly was a pace she knew how to keep. It turned out he was less patient than she was. Not in any way that was improper or sudden or that crossed any of the lines she had drawn. He was more careful with her than she had expected any man in his position to be capable of being, but he was deliberate. He was present in ways he had not been before, ways that were easy to explain individually and impossible to explain collectively, except as intention. He was in rooms she was in. He asked questions of Fedor that resulted in information about the household, its patterns, its people, finding its way back to him in ways that suggested he was paying attention to more than the accounts. And on the 4th evening after his mother left, he came to the kitchen, not to the serving corridor, not to a door that could be understood as private or manageable or containable. He came to the kitchen itself, where Ksenia was scrubbing the large pot and one of the older cooks was banking the fire, and he stood in the doorway and asked Miroslava, in a voice that was normal and unhurried, whether she would walk with him. The pot scrubbing stopped. The fire banking stopped. Miroslava wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist and looked at him and decided that this was the pace, and she had agreed to the pace. "Yes," she said. They walked the long corridor that ran the inner length of the house, which was lit at intervals by wall sconces, and warm in the way of enclosed spaces that have held heat all day. He walked beside her at a distance that was appropriate, and she walked beside him, and they were both aware of the distance, and both aware that they were aware of it, and this awareness she was learning was its own form of closeness. He asked her about her mother, not about her history, not the version she had assembled as a careful answer for employers who asked too many questions, but about her mother specifically, her name, what she was like, and Miroslava answered and heard herself talking about her mother with something approaching actual memory rather than summary. The way her mother laughed before she finished her own jokes, the way she called Miroslava by a shortened version of her name that no one else used, the small particular things that survived grief intact even when everything else went. He listened in the way of a person who is not assembling a response while you speak, but is simply receiving what you are saying. And she had been talked at enough in her life to understand the difference immediately and to feel it in a disproportionate way. "You miss her," he said. "Every day," she said. "Though she is not gone, she is simply far and smaller than she was, and sometimes that is harder." He was quiet for a moment. "My father was like that at the end," he said. "There, but reduced. It took longer than it should have for me to understand that I was grieving him while he was still alive, and that this was allowed." She looked at him sideways, and he was looking ahead. but the line of his jaw was different from his managed expression, softer, more open, the face of someone who has said something true without first deciding to. She thought about the portrait in the study, his mother, at a younger, simpler time. "Were you close to him?" she asked. "I wanted to be," he said. "I was better at it when I stopped trying to be what I thought he wanted and became simply what I was." She stored this away. She stored everything he offered like this, these fragments that were not performance, and she thought that this was what she had been searching for in the long months of managing herself carefully in rooms full of people who looked through her. Not safety exactly, not comfort. Someone who was also underneath the title and the stone walls and the managed face, simply what they were. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The day you came to the servants' corridor." She kept her voice even and her eyes forward. "You said you had believed it was operational reasons for 2 days longer than you should have. What made you stop believing it?" Pause. "I walked past the laundry," he said, "on my way to the eastern storeroom. I was not looking for anything. I heard your voice through the door, talking to one of the women down there, and you were explaining to her how to get a particular stain out of linen, and you were kind about it, very patient, and I stood in the corridor and listened for 30 seconds, and then I thought, this is not right. This is not where she belongs. And then I thought, which is the thought I was trying not to have, that the only thing I wanted in that moment was to fix it." She was quiet. "That is when I stopped believing it was operational," he said. They had reached the end of the corridor, where a tall window looked out onto the south grounds, silver blue in the evening dark, frost catching the last of the light. They stopped without discussing it, both turning toward the window, and stood side by side with their reflections faint in the glass. She could see both of them there. The woman in the dark working dress with her careful posture, and the man beside her who was the same height as his reflection and somehow larger than it. She thought it was a strange portrait they made, and also that she did not mind it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "Not for any single thing," he said. "For the months before. I was aware of you earlier than I showed. I noticed, and I said nothing, and I kept my distance because the distance was easier. And I told myself it was appropriate, and I knew, honestly, that appropriate and easier were the same thing dressed differently." He looked at the window, not at her reflection. "You were struck at my table, and I had created conditions where it could happen by choosing convenient blindness. I am sorry for that." She had not expected this. She had prepared herself over months of careful living for many versions of how men behaved, but this version, the plain accountable version with no theatre and no self-congratulation, was not one she had needed to prepare for because she had not believed she would encounter it. She turned to look at him directly. "I accept that," she said, "and I want you to know that I have been watching you these past months in the way a person watches when they cannot afford to be wrong. And what I have seen is a man who is trying genuinely to be better than what is expected of him. That is not a small thing." He looked at her then, and the expression was the one she had been filing away all this time, and she finally, standing in the window light, found a name for it. It was recognition. The look of someone who sees themselves reflected accurately for the first time in a long time and does not flinch at the reflection. She turned back to the window. "My name," she said, "the shortened version, the one my mother uses, is Mira, a breath." "Mira," he said. She had not been called that in 2 years. It arrived in her chest the way the things you have been missing arrive when you finally find them, not with triumph exactly, but with something quieter and more total. "Yes," she said simply. They stood at the window for a while longer without speaking, and the silence was the kind that does not need to be filled, that has its own fullness, that two people can stand inside of together without either of them disappearing. In the days that followed, things grew. Not quickly and not recklessly, but with the steady, organic pace of things that are real rather than performed. She moved through the house with a different quality of presence, not the pressed-down, invisible precision she had built as armor, but something that still held its shape under pressure while allowing itself to be seen. Ksenia noticed and beamed about it with the transparent joy of the very young, which was both touching and slightly mortifying. Even Agrafena noticed, in the way of a housekeeper who notices everything and comments on nothing, managing only a slight adjustment in her expression when Miroslava passed that might, under generous interpretation, have been approval. He gave her access to the library. He told her through Fedor, properly, with the kind of formality that meant he was doing it correctly rather than privately, that the library was open to household members who wished to use it during non-service hours. It was clearly directed at her, and they both knew it, and Fedor knew it, and she suspected everyone in the house knew it, and she went to the library on the second evening and stayed for 2 hours with a volume of natural philosophy that she did not entirely understand and loved completely, and at no point did he appear or intrude or make it a moment, and the not making it a moment was perhaps the finest thing he had done. She wrote to her mother, not a short note, not the careful, measured correspondence she had sent over the past 2 years, which said she was well and working and managing without letting in any detail that might cause worry. She wrote a long letter, her pen moving faster than she could manage the composition. And she told her mother about the house, and about Ksenia, and about the library, and she did not say his name, but she said that she had been seen here clearly and properly by someone worth being seen by, and that she was no longer certain the future was a thing to be survived rather than moved toward. She sealed it and gave it to the post, and walked back through the house and up the main stairs, and as she reached the first landing, she nearly walked directly into him coming down. They both stopped. He was carrying a book. She noticed it because it was an incongruous thing to carry with such evident lack of self-consciousness, as though he was simply a person who walked the stairs of his own house with a book in his hand and had no performance to maintain about it. She looked at the book. He looked at her. "Natural philosophy," she said. He looked at what she was carrying. She had not realized she was still carrying her own volume from the library. "Natural philosophy," he said. She laughed. It was short and real and entirely unmanaged, and she felt it leave her chest and fill the staircase for 1 second before she collected herself. And when she looked at him, his face had done something extraordinary. It had opened completely, the managed expression entirely gone, and he was smiling in the way of someone who was not used to being surprised by joy and had just been surprised by it. She pressed her lips together and looked at her book. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, and stepped past him on the stairs. and she could feel that she was smiling as she moved, and she let herself feel it because no one was watching except him. And she had decided at some point between the laundry and the corridor and the window light that being watched by him was not something she needed to protect herself from any more. She heard him continue up the stairs behind her. "Good evening, Mira," he said. She did not turn around. She kept walking, and she let the sound of her name settle in her chest. And she thought that tomorrow was coming the way tomorrows came now, not as a thing to brace against, but as a plain and ordinary gift. And the difference between those two ways of receiving a morning was the entire sum of what this house had done to her. She went to her room. She sat by the narrow window and looked out at the frozen grounds, at the trees standing dark against the sky, at the long white distance of the estate grounds under winter, and she thought about her mother and her father and Gennady Yurlov and the floors she had studied and the rooms she had been invisible in and all the stopping she had done, and she thought that none of it was wasted, not a single hard day of it, because it had made her into a woman who could stand in a dining room after being struck and not collapse, and who could say, "I need it to move at a pace I can trust to a duke in a corridor and mean it," and who could receive the words "Good evening, Mira" on a staircase and know exactly what they were worth. She was not the same person who had come to this house 8 months ago. She was something further along than that, something that had not finished becoming what it was going to be, but that knew itself well enough now to trust its own direction. She put her book on the windowsill and folded her hands in her lap, and outside the window the estate was cold and still and enormous, and she was here inside it, and she was warm, and she was whole, and she was, for the first time in a long time, entirely unafraid of what came next. If stayed till the end and you enjoyed the story and want to see more, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more exciting tales and updates. Your support means the world.